Welcome back. I am Portia, and we are continuing with the reading of White Rage, the unspoken truth of our racial divide. If you are just joining me, thank you for being here. We are working our way through chapter 2 right now. If you'd like to get caught up, you can find the rest of the chapters on both my Patreon as well as my YouTube channel. Chapter 2 is Derailing the Great Migration, and right now we're kind of discussing the attempts that were put in to stop African Americans from leaving the South and going north as a way to try and find some freedom. If you are reading along, we are on chapter 50, and we will be in the second full paragraph. So we'll be starting. The police chief in Meridian, Mississippi, ordered the newspaper confiscated from dealers. The newspaper that we're talking about is the Chicago Tribune. Other locales soon followed suit. Montgomery passed an ordinance that any person, firm, or corporation who published, printed, or wrote, or delivered, or distributed, or posted any advertisement, letter, newspaper, pamphlet, handbill, or other writing for the purpose of enticing, persuading, or influencing any laborer to leave the city of Montgomery for the purpose of being employed as a laborer would be sentenced up to 6 months hard labor and fined $100. A judge in Pine Bluff, Arkansas issued an injunction banning the distribution of the Chicago Defenders people we're talking about anywhere in the country. So they were threatening hard labor and a fine for simply talking about this publication that was giving information about how African Americans would be able to flee the South or leave the South. However, these maneuvers succeeded only in forcing the paper underground. Like a resistance movement in a totalitarian society, a network of Black railroad porters, ministers, and teachers, even under the stress of surveillance, worked to circumvent the ban using the postal system and smuggling the paper and bulk goods. Indeed, the attempt to keep the Defender out of the hands of African Americans was only increase the paper's credibility and importance. While the ban on the Chicago Defender cut right to the core of American democracy, Southern states' assault on the First Amendment extended far beyond that newspaper. As the law in Montgomery made clear, the very idea of freedom of movement and the concept that labor could go anywhere it could get the best package had to be stopped. Thus, in Georgia, 2 men who carried a poem railing against the sharecropping system, lynching, and unequal pay were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 30 days in jail for carrying incendiary literature. While in Franklin, Mississippi, an African American preacher who sold the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, magazine Crisis was hit with a $400 fine and sentenced to 5 months on the country farm. Again, the continuation of history. This is leaning very much into the book bans that we're seeing now, and these efforts to ban books or ban classes that will talk to the history. Regardless of Southern officials' efforts, wave after wave of Black people continued to leave. Nothing seemed to stop the flow. The officials, therefore, decided to go after the railroad system. The logic was simple. If the ideas that led to the exodus couldn't be stopped, then certainly the physical means by which hundreds of thousands had already left the region could be. A variety of tactics was employed. One was to physically prevent the trains from moving. A waylaid train could wreak havoc with schedules even under optimal conditions, but conditions weren't optimal. With World War I raging, the shipment of personnel and material was crucial to supporting the Allies. Nevertheless, white Southern leaders prioritized their need to stop the advancement of African Americans above all other considerations, including victory over the nation that had sunk the Lusitania and killed nearly 1,200 passengers and crew members. It was most egregious in Mississippi, where in Greenville, Greenwood, and Brookhaven, trains were stopped and sometimes sidetracked for days. The federal government finally stepped in when the police chief in Meridian, Mississippi, held up a train on a technicality. The U.S. Marshal arrested the city's highest-ranking lawman on the spot. Recognizing that there was more than one way to disrupt the flow, Jackson, Mississippi's officials threatened to rig pending court decisions if the railroad did not stop handing out passes for African Americans to go north. They were ready to rig the court decisions. In addition to strangling interstate commerce and being willing to hijack the legal system to blackmail the railroads into submission, authorities went after African Americans directly. In Albany, Georgia, the police ripped up the tickets of Black passengers who were on the platform waiting to board. Jacksonville Mayor J.E.T. Bowden was upset that there were so many Black men near the labor recruiting station and trying to board trains that he had the police chief arrest them for vagrancy and told the nearly 500 men that they would not be allowed to leave the city for better jobs. Memphis Police Inspector Earl Barnard seized 26 northbound African Americans, charged them with vagrancy, and then routed them to a plantation in Arkansas in what can only be called peonage. In Hattiesburg, Mississippi, the ticket agent, under advice and counsel of the town's citizens, simply refused to sell any tickets to African Americans. When Blacks tried to circumvent the dragnet by walking many miles to use another station, they were manhandled by police at the railroad stations and then charged with vagrancy. In Americus, Georgia, Blacks trying to go north faced a dense network of local police and county sheriffs who were armed with state-issued arrest warrants. Herded into the jails, even though none of the officials knew for sure whether it was legal to detain someone simply because they wanted to go north, African Americans weren't released until the trains had left the city. A very strategic move to make sure that African Americans stayed in the city. The Macon Telegraph grimaced at such far-flung efforts at coercion. We are not slaveholders. We do not own the Negroes. We cannot compel them to stay here. Indeed, all the heavy-handed tactics boomeranged. Blacks weren't intimidated. Instead, they were more determined than ever to leave. In desperation, the mayor of New Orleans wired the president of the Illinois Central Railroad, asking his company to stop carrying Negroes to the north. In a reply that was a primer on basic federal law and economics, the railroad executive explained that neither his company nor any other one, given the Interstate Commerce Clause, could refuse to sell tickets or provide transportation to paying customers. Moreover, he pointed out, given the relatively high wages that Blacks were now getting in the North, the South needed to brace itself. The exodus would surely continue. Rather than brace themselves, the same Southern leaders who had always been such staunch and proud adherents of states' rights now lobbied the federal government for help. They recognized that the nation's mobilization for World War I could provide the perfect patriotic cover, despite their own string of transgressions, to stanch the flood of Blacks out of the South. In 1918, the Selective Service Division of the federal government issued a work or fight order that required every able-bodied person to be either inducted into the armed services or employed in the key industries the nation needed to wage total war. Instead, the white South took full advantage of the fog of the war to keep African Americans from migrating north, conjuring up a new version of the infamous vagrancy laws that had fueled the convict lease labor system after the Civil War. Southern officials used so-called councils of defense to corral Black bodies for planters, mill operators, and other employers. The justification of this new form of bondage as a defense of God and country was a fig leaf to cover the Southern states' true self-serving motives. Assistant Secretary of Labor Louis F. Post admitted that he had found the work or fight order was being used for peonage purposes and that employers were conscripting labor for private use rather than for the service to the war effort. Equally revealing was his concession that the majority of workers were Black. The NAACP added that it was no accident that the widespread abuse of the work or fight order lined up exactly with that portion of the territory of the U.S. in which the institution of chattel slavery formerly existed. The chief of the United States Employment Services, a man from Meridian, Mississippi, in fact, vowed that the first thing he was going to do was see that niggers were stopped from going north. That was his mission statement. That was his platform. The reasons other officials rose up to try to stop the great migration of a people for whom they had clearly had such contempt goes far beyond the easy default response of labor. Black flight threatened much more than the economic foundation of a feudal society. African Americans' determination to have achieved their full potential endangered the legalistic, biological, and philosophical tenets of a racially oppressive system. Black prosperity and success, indeed Black intelligence, were unimaginable and thus justified the disparate funding and education that had led to abysmal schools and made the brutality of the criminal justice system necessary. It propped up skewed, racially based pay scales. The whole culture of the white South was erected on the presumption of Black inability. And the Great Migration directly challenged that foundation. The whole culture of the white South was erected on the presumption of Black inability. They fully felt that Black people were unable to do anything on their own, to learn on their own, to provide for themselves or their family on their own, to work on their own, to find their own jobs. They fully believed that Black people were unable to do that. And the Great Migration directly challenged that foundation. Black success was the white South's boogeyman. And the fear of this engendered erupted in ticketed passengers being dragged off trains, interstate commerce getting blocked, the wartime needs of the nation going ignored, and labor becoming criminalized for taking its skills to an employer willing to pay. Still, African Americans continued to leave. As the Chicago Defender crowed in 1922, more thousands kissed the South a last goodbye. Mississippi Delta is being stripped of laborers. Every train brings guests north. Yet the land above the Mason-Dixon line was, as Du Bois remarked, no paradise and certainly no haven from oppression. African Americans who went to the North simply stepped into a new articulation of the seething, corrosive hatred underlying so much of the nation's social compact. Beginning in 1917 and going into the 1920s, so-called race riots, which were essentially lynchings on a grander scale, erupted in East St. Louis, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and numerous other cities. I want to stop for a quick moment. As we're discovering in this chapter with the Great Migration, and a huge help in that, or a huge part of that, is Chicago. The Chicago Defender, Chicago talking about what's happening, Chicago giving information for African Americans to leave the South. This is what's happening in Chicago. And it's very interesting that today Chicago is such a dog whistle for agents of white supremacy when they are talking, and racist as a whole, when they're talking about the violent places or where the most violent Black people are. You know, if you want to talk about the violence in America, what about Chicago? What about Chicago? We always hear Chicago as this big, scary place when essentially, and again, the North was still racist, just less violent, I guess we can say, so far than the North. But Chicago was still integral in helping Black people leave. Which, of course, would make it an easy dog whistle when trying to have a revisionist history. Though labeled riots, these outbursts are more like rampages where whites went hunting for African Americans to pummel, burn, and torture. Killing was just an added bonus. In some instances, as in Chicago, Blacks fought back. But in all instances, they were outnumbered. In Chicago alone, 23 African Americans were killed and 1,000 Black families were left homeless. During the Red Summer of 1919, there were, in fact, 78 lynchings, including a man burned at the stake in Omaha, Nebraska. That's my hometown. More than just white fears of Black competition for jobs ignited rampant violence against African Americans. Anxieties about housing played a big role. Chicago, for example, had hemmed the Black population into tight, confined areas with finite housing possibilities. In 1917, the Chicago Urban League found that real estate agents had so constricted the supply of homes for African Americans that on one day alone, only 50 houses were available for 664 Black applicants. Remember when I said it wasn't less racist, just differently racist. Given the basic economics of supply, which was limited, and demand, which was great, rents skyrocketed up to 50% higher for this decaying housing stock. For decades after, when it appeared that African Americans were moving into white neighborhoods, race riots became an all too familiar drumbeat to drive Blacks back to overcrowded, dilapidated slums. In one case, a young Jewish couple, Aaron and Louise Beinman, was suspected of hosting an African American boarder. Some of the mob was actually up on our porch, pushing on the door, the wife recalled. We were terrified. We put empty bottles on the floor to slow them down if they were actually got inside. We had already barricaded the doors, and I remember breaking the table legs off our kitchen table to defend ourselves. We started boiling water to throw on anybody coming in. We were pretty defenseless. Her husband then explained we didn't expect help from the police, who were obviously assisting the hoodlums. With 5,000 to 10,000 whites coming to run them and the phantom African American border out of the Chicago neighborhood of Inglewood, the couple was defenseless. While spared a full blown riot during the first wave of the Great Migration, 1950 to 1940, Detroit simmered in unmasked hatred against the tens of thousands of blacks who now called that city home. Previously, there had been an uneasy truce between the white community and the relatively small number of African Americans in Detroit. But during the exodus, in just 18 months, the African American population in the Motor City quadrupled as as the automobile industry provided job opportunities and possibilities for advancement almost unimaginable to those who had dealt with Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Employees at Ford, with an industry-setting pay scale of $5 an hour, could make in a single day what it took a prosperous sharecropper some 2 months or more to earn. And so they kept coming. By the mid 1920s, there were 10 times as many blacks in Detroit as there had been in 1915. And then the tenuous truce shattered. While the Great Migration had led to nearly exponential growth in the number of African Americans who called Detroit home, the area where they were supposed to live, Black Bottom, had never expanded. Realtors, insurance agents, banks, and landlords had devised a witch's brew of schemes and machinations, such as redlining and restrictive covenants, to cordon off wide swaths of Detroit's housing stock from African Americans and carve a color line through the city. And so the small stretch of land called Black Bottom became engorged with 10 times the number of people it once held. Less than half the homes in this ghetto in the making had indoor plumbing. Less than half the homes in this ghetto in the making had indoor plumbing, although in the urban north, a bathroom was a norm. More than 15% of families were forced to live in one-room apartments. Nearly one-third of all Black families were crammed into four-room homes. But despite the clearly debilitating and disastrous effects of this brutal reality, Michigan's Supreme Court, relying on the precedents of Cruikshank, the civil rights cases, and Plessy, upheld racially restrictive housing policies as constitutional as Parmalee versus Morris in 1922. Tired of the cramped living conditions and exasperated with paying exorbitant rents for ramshackle housing that the landlords refused to repair, Black professionals sought to move away from Black Bottom. That aspiration, however, was fraught with danger. While a few managed to find homes in white neighborhoods, others faced the wrath of mobs and homeowners associations. In the summer of 1925, for example, Dr. Alexander Turner, Dunbar Hospital's co-founder and head of surgery, tried to move into the home he had purchased in an all-white part of town. Dr. Alexander Turner, Dunbar Hospital's co-founder and head of surgery, tried to move into the home he purchased in an all-white part of town, Tyerman. Within 5 hours of his unpacking his first box, bricks and rocks rained down as a mob 1,000 strong moved in to drive him out. With Detroit police officers watching, he was compelled to sign a deed and relinquish ownership of the property at gunpoint. The police then escorted Turner and his family back to the Black side of town. This is a doctor. And it should not matter what this person did. It should not matter what this person's profession was. But it goes to show that it does not matter even if if African Americans were meeting what society considered a successful part of life. It wasn't enough. Dr. Ossian Sweet, who was also on staff at Dunbar Hospital, like Turner, dared breach the color line in Detroit. It was unclear to him why Black Bottom had to be his only option. He had a medical degree from Howard University. He was married to a beautiful, sophisticated woman, and he was a loving father to a baby girl, Sweet. Sweet with his carefully trimmed hair, tailored suits, and tortoiseshell glasses wanted a home befitting a man who had emerged from the abject poverty of the Deep South to become a physician with a thriving practice in Detroit. He was the embodiment of the American dream. And if we take the American dream for what we've been taught, absolutely, he pulled himself up by the bootstraps. He got educated. He got himself clean cut, looking nice. On September 8th, 1925, Sweet began to move into his new house on the corner of Garland Avenue in Charlevoix. It was a nice bungalow, perhaps the finest house in the neighborhood, though it was no upscale community, but rather a marginal white neighborhood in Detroit. Residents were not college educated. There wasn't a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant among them. They were pipe fitters, factory foremen, blue collar workers. The next day, a mob, spurred by the number of meetings of the Homeowners Association, began to form outside his house. Sweet was well aware of what had already happened to his colleague, Dr. Turner. Sweet, well aware of what had happened to his colleague, Dr. Turner, was prepared and had asked his brother and some friends to help him protect his property. He had firsthand knowledge of what a mob could do. When Sweet was a young boy in Florida, an African American teenager who lived around the corner from him was accused of rape, tied to a tree, and burned alive. Sweet had also been in Washington, D.C. during the Red Summer 1919 when police allowed whites to rampage for days, slaughtering black people. The tide turned only after returning African American veterans had seen enough, polished their rifles, and begun shooting. The next year, Sweet's relatives in Osceola, Florida, lived in the part of town that whites incinerated in the single bloodiest day in American political history. Whites went into hunting for a black man who had dared approach the ballot box in the 1920 presidential election, and in the process killed scores of African Americans and ethnically cleansed the town until it became all white for nearly 60 years. As a result of his experience, Ossie and Sweet had packed, among all the moving boxes and satchels, a small arsenal of guns and 400 pounds of ammunition. Sweet made sure to alert the police that trouble was brewing. Several officers arrived on the scene, but they hung back from the house, even as the crowd continued to grow. Then, as the sun set and two of Sweet's friends arrived in a taxi, rocks suddenly began to pummel the home on Garland Avenue. Sweet heard angry shouts of, "Here's niggers, get them, get them." As his friends rushed into the house, the mob was like a tsunami. Sweet saw a human sea. Stones kept coming faster. Windows in the home shattered. Some of the men in the home, including Sweet's brother Henry, grabbed guns, and as rocks continued to rain down, they fired a full volley, 20 rounds. 2 white men went down. One, Leon Bernier, a factory foreman who lived just across the street, was fatally wounded. The police, finally shaken out of their lethargy, sprang into action. They stormed the house, arrested Sweet, his wife, and the 10 men who had come to his aid and hauled them out of there. The Sweets were clearly in trouble, but it was a neighborhood association that had made abundantly clear its main goal: to get rid of them by any means necessary, including violence. Almost the moment they purchased a home, notices for a never heard of before homeowners association sprang up in the neighborhood, inviting all concerned residents to a meeting to determine how to act in self-defense and stop the invasion. The main speaker at the gathering was the president of the Tireman Homeowners Association, which had made front page news in Detroit as it forcibly expelled or repelled the Turners and 2 other black families that had tried to move into his all-white neighborhood. "We have the model for how to do this," he told the throng of 700. "Use legal means if necessary, force if necessary, but put the niggers out. Put them out." Then a mob, which the media and the police initially estimated to be anywhere between 300 and 5,000 people, encircled Sweet's home. Rocks crashed through the bedroom windows and sat on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. Other stones littered the lawn, porch, and roof. Racial epithets singed the air as a mob surged toward the house. The clearly violent intent of the mob should have saved the Sweets from the legal trouble that loomed on the horizon. But his aspirations, his ambition, nullified, if not justified, that intent and triggered a concerted response from the police, the prosecutor's office, the liberal, anti Klan mayor, and the media itself as they set to turn self defense into premeditated murder and throw 11 Black people, including a physician, a law student, and a federal narcotics officer, in prison forever. The police officer in charge of the Sweets home that evening, Inspector Norton Shucknecht, who had a ringside seat to the shooting, stated that there had been no crowd around Sweet's house on Garland Avenue. There had been people milling about, he claimed, chatting with each other, but nothing that suggested a mob, and certainly nothing that indicated the Sweets were in danger. When he charged into the home after the bullets went flying, after he yelled at Sweet, "For Christ's sake, what the hell are you fellows shooting about?" When the doctor pointed to the rocks shattering his windows and pounding against the roof, Shuckneck scoffed, "What have they done? I haven't seen a man throwing stones, and I haven't heard any commotion or anything else." In the police officer's estimation, Sweet's posse, for its own nefarious reasons, simply pointed its arsenals, took aim, and fired at neighborly whites for an evening stroll. Taking into account the rocks that officers had found in the upstairs bedroom amid so much broken glass, Shucknecht insisted the stones came after the shooting. His sequence of events, shots, then rocks, made clear that this had not been self-defense. Rather, Leon Briner had been executed. This is a story the officer repeated to the press, to the prosecutor, and then to the jury, never conveying the impressions of his brother-in-law, who, there with him that evening, caught snatches of bitterness seething through the growing crowd, including someone saying, "Damn, funny thing that the police wouldn't go in there and drag those niggers out." We're going to pause there for a minute. It continues on with what happened at Sweet's house, but I want to pause there for a minute. We've talked before, and I'm sure you've all heard about covert racism versus overt racism and which one is better. And many people that don't face racism believe that the overt racism is easier to deal with. It's not as in your face. It's not as seemingly violent. The thing is that racism is racism. And covert racism at least lets us know what we're working with. African Americans in the South dealt with that covert racism, which is why they needed to leave. It was in their face. They were being killed just for existing or trying to have a life. And the North gave this illusion that it was so much better than the South by offering advice on how to leave, by fighting against not being able to have these tickets on the railroads. It all seemed as though they were allies until actually in the North, Chicago people pushing back, Detroit people pushing back. Racism is racism, and it's continued. You know, what we talked about today, the beginning of it, the book bans are familiar. And now talking about the redlining and doing everything to push Black people out of these neighborhoods, even though, again, they're meeting the quote unquote standards that seem like they should be able to live in these neighborhoods. The police standing back and not stepping in until one of their own, and not a police officer, but a white person, is now affected, then lying about what happened. None of this is new. None of that has stopped. And it is all continued. It is more proof that there is nothing to a certain set of people, there is nothing that Black people will do to be deemed worthy of the most basic of human rights, including housing, education, a job, and existing. All of these things. The journal prompt that I want you to have, the journal prompt that I have for you is going to be a continuation of, again, kind of aligning where do you see the comparisons of today from 1915 to 1940, like we discussed today. Where do you see that? Where have you seen incidents where a government official or somebody has skewed the information to fit the narrative that protects the white person but puts the Black person in danger? And also, what do you feel with this? I always want that to be part of your journal entry as well. What do you feel when you are hearing this? What are you feeling when you are reading this? Where are you feeling in your body? What is it bringing up? Because it should be bringing something up. Because again, I'm reading a book about the history, but I could be reading a book about what happened last week. What's it making you feel? What's it activating in you? And from what you're being activated by, or what feelings are being activated, what's your next step? What do you feel that you are able to do in your community after hearing this chapter? Thank you again for being with me. I appreciate you. Again, this book it's heavy. It's a lot of information, so make sure that you're being gentle with yourself and staying hydrated. And I will see you all next week for a continuation of chapter 2. All right, have a good day.